Ladies, gents, thems, my name is Ash Morgan and welcome to my channel. We talk about all things gay history. If queer historical figures are your vibe, then go ahead and like and subscribe. So today we are going to be talking about the OG lesbian herself, Sappho. A note on that, I actually have found even more OG lesbian than Sappho, but we are just going to pretend for today and I'll make that another video for another day. So Sappho, you may have heard the terms sapphic or lesbian, basically the biggest used words for any lady who loves women, okay? So obviously sapphic came from Sappho. Sappho was from the island of Lesbos in ancient Greece, and so subsequently lesbian, people just connected the dots. Funnily enough, the word lesbian actually really just means from Lesbos. Sappho was actually born in somewhere around 620 to 630 BCE, aka like 600 years before Christ was born. So a hot second ago. This was in actually the ancient Greek Archaic period. And they had a big emphasis on the arts, writing, painting, all those jazzy things. The island of Lesbos actually was especially known for its poetry, which was pretty much all sung to the lyre, so it was like lyric poetry. I heard in a podcast called Sweet Bitter, which is all about Sappho, they compared ancient Lesbos to basically a modern day Nashville. And Sappho would basically be the Taylor Swift of her time, and she was much like Taylor Swift. She could sing your praises, but also be a little bitchy. You definitely did not want to break up with or wrong Sappho in any way, because there would be a lyric poem to pay. You would hear yourself drag across the mud in the next lyrical poem to come out. So Sappho actually wrote 10,000 lines of poetry. Do not ask me how historians know that, but somehow they do. And yet we only have about 3% of her writing, which is 650 fragmented lines of poetry. So when I say fragmented, I'm talking like so much of her work has been burned, because it was in the Library of Alexandria, and it's just kind of decayed through the years. Okay, so I've done research since I did this video, and turns out that actually the majority of her work was destroyed by the church for being too erotic and yay, about 300 or 400 years after Christ. So yeah, the Library of Alexandria happened, but that was not even the worst thing to happen to Sappho's work. And so a lot of it had to be found in other countries that had written down her stuff, like in Egypt on random bits of papyrus. Love the church. All that we've pretty much been able to find has been a bunch of papyrus. She only has one full poem that we have still, which is the Ode to Aphrodite, her pretty much most famous poem. All of her other poems are just little fragments. When it comes to translating Sappho, there has been a lot of debate and a lot of issues. She created like her own iambic pentameter. God, she basically created her own poetry style. It's so hard because you can't like fully translate ancient Greek to English and keep that same like syllable amount. It just doesn't work. And also get the same meaning. So a lot of translators have taken a lot of liberties. Sappho's poetry is still beautiful and I love it. It's definitely different with every translator, and you have to kind of be careful which one you read, because a lot of poets have either taken their own liberties or have kind of erased her sexuality from it, which we'll talk about later. Sappho is actually one of the 9 most influential poets in the Library of Alexandria. Let's take a moment for that, RIP. And she was thought to be up there with Homer and Plato, which is so fascinating because I remember learning all about Homer and Plato in high school, but where was Sappho? I never learned a single thing about Sappho. Like, why do you possibly think that would be? Oh yeah, I don't know, patriarchy? So Sappho, like I said, her poetry was actually meant to be performed to music. She was big on the lyre, big lyre gal, okay? She actually ended up inventing her own type of lyre to really just go with her music. Along with that, she also was the inventor of the plectrum, which is basically the first precursor to the modern day guitar pick. Now, why the hell would you need a guitar pick back then? Well, the lyre was generally played with the fingernails to strum it. If you were a lady, loving lady back in the day, and you needed to play the lyre, but also play the lady and have short nails, what is a lesbian gal to do? Well, Sappho was like, I'm not letting this stop me. My two biggest loves in the world, the lyre and the ladies. I have to find a way to make this work. Oh, and so the plectrum. So Sappho had a very unique style of writing, especially for the time. A lot of the men of the days were glorifying war and battle and talking about all that bullshit, whereas Sappho was really breaking down her feelings for other women. And men might describe love more like from the outside appearance or just, you know, falling for somebody or just being an arranged marriage or whatever. It was very surface level, whereas Sappho took her poetry deep. She was a queen at helping you to visualize the objects of her affection without actually even describing their physical features much, more off of how they made her feel, which was huge. Now let's take a step back to ancient Greece and kind of see where society was at this time, because she was obviously an out lesbian. Was that normal? I actually thought that it was. I had heard a lot about Greece basically being like the birthplace of homosexuality, and obviously knowing about Sappho, I was like, duh, like it just must have been different times back then, like gayness all around was just encouraged. Not exactly. So even back in Sappho's time in ancient Greece, it was a patriarchal society, and there was still this expectation on women to get married, to help political alliances with their parents, to get married to men, have their babies, stay home with them, and just be a good wife. However, Greece still was a little bit more open, and there still was possibility, especially if you were an aristocrat, which Sappho luckily was. So her parents had money, and as you know from my videos about Anne Lister, you can really get away with being a lesbian and doing all the things that you want when you have money. A lot of her poetry is about longing, it's about heartbreak, it's about women breaking her heart basically, and admiring and desiring women from afar. And why was that such a theme? It seems that she also got a lot of women. However, it seems that all these relationships end in heartbreak and longing. And why is that? Well, like I said, it was a man's world back then. It was still expected that women would go get married, and especially if some of her lovers were not as well off as she, or if her parents had high expectations for them and needed them to marry to help them politically or financially, what choice did they have? Like, a lot of these women had to go get married off to husbands, which is a very unfortunate thing that is a tale as old as time, has been happening over all of the centuries. Just to kind of look at what was going on in the world back then, there were these marriages and everyone was pretty much getting married to these heterosexual marriages. However, men were pretty much allowed to do whatever the hell they wanted. A lot of them would have these wives, but then also these male lovers. And it was very common in ancient Greece, and in fact respected and encouraged, to have these male partnerships. And it was a very particular type of male partnership. Ancient Greeks actually believed that the most spiritual and pure love that you could have is between two men, one older and one younger. So there was this whole concept called pederasty, which was huge back in the day. For any man who was well esteemed and a member of society with some kind of talent, he would basically take on a younger male lover and protege, usually within the ages of like 13 to 17. And he would basically tutor this young man and teach him everything that he knew about his art. And meanwhile, they would also have a sexual and emotional relationship. And a fun fact about that, sorry to get a little graphic, in pederasty, the older man was called the Erastes, and the younger man was the Eromenos. So the Erastes respected the Eromenos so much. As a future member of society in Rome, he respected his body and didn't want to violate it by penetration. So a lot of these relationships were more sensual, still sexual, but it would be more of a the older man rubbing his eggplant between the younger man's legs instead, and other sensual things. A lot of the reason why they thought of these relationships as being so pure, because they weren't being defiled by penetration, which just shows you what they thought of women. And apparently any men who were wanting that penetration with other men were totally allowed to go find that in their slaves, in the resident aliens who were living in Greece from other countries. That's fucked up. As well as any brothel workers. And then of course, they, could get down with their wives. It's also funny to note that apparently it just wasn't as common for women to at least be out and dating only women, because there was this expectation to marry. And in general, men just didn't understand the concept of a woman not needing a man. It just, threatened them. A lot of women at the time, according to historians, who were interested in other women would actually just take that up with a prostitute in a brothel and pay for that lady lovin'. I'm gonna read a little excerpt of the Ode to Aphrodite, which is, like I said, the only poem that is not fragmented. It's the entire poem. I'm just gonna read a little bit of it though. Basically, the premise is that Sappho is calling upon her goddess that she prays to, Aphrodite. She's very devout to Aphrodite, and she calls upon Aphrodite in her poem, and Aphrodite comes down to greet her and in like a chariot and finds her, and it's just like, Sappho, like, what is it now? Who's hurt you? What do you need? In case you don't know, Aphrodite is the goddess of love. So this is a few lines from it once she is talking to Aphrodite. So Aphrodite says, "Who, O Sappho, is doing you wrong? For if she runs now, soon she'll follow. If she won't accept gifts, soon she'll give them. And if she doesn't love now, soon she'll love you, even reluctantly." So this is an interesting line. Different translators say it differently. Some will say reluctantly, some will say unwillingly, which I think are just kind of trigger words for us these days, because it does sound a little, I don't want to say words that will get me in trouble with YouTube. It does sound not consensual. But a lot of historians have talked about this, and how basically what the lines are getting at is the fact that lesbian relationships at the time, and basically in general, are more equal than any relationship involving a man. So they have this power dynamic where they can switch. So one woman might pursue the other and then subsequently be pursued by them, and it can go back and forth, and it's this pursuing of each other and just being able to switch roles. Whereas men at the time had a hard time not having a power dynamic in some way, even with their relationship with men. This poem by Sappho is alluding to the fact that, like, I've been chasing this girl, now it's her turn to chase me. The tables can turn at any moment, and we have this like switch energy that can happen. It's a give and take and an equal thing, basically, which freaked a whole lot of men out, because imagine a woman wanting to exist without you. God, scary concept. Even though Aphrodite was like one of the greatest women of her time, she was still subject to a lot of patriarchy, especially after her death. So a lot of people debate, like, was Sappho actually straight in real life and she just wrote about women? Was she writing about women from the perspective of a man? Was she taking on the persona of being a man in her poetry? Or was she just downright a man? Can you even imagine a woman writing this great of poetry? Let me just read a nice little gay poem for you by Sappho. This is fragment 31. "That man to me seems equal to the gods, the man who sits opposite you, and close by listens to your sweet voice and your enticing laughter. That indeed has stirred up the heart in my breast. For whenever I look at you, even briefly, I can no longer say a single thing, but my tongue is frozen in silence. Instantly a delicate flame runs beneath my skin. With my eyes I see nothing, my ears make a whirring noise. A cold sweat covers me, trembling seizes my body, and I am greener than grass, lacking but little of death do I seem." I don't think you can really debate that that's not gay. It's so frustrating because Sappho was up there with Homer and Plato. And Plato talked a lot about liking men, okay? And nobody even questions him. They're like, great, he likes men, he's gay or whatever the hell. And they just take that at face value. But as soon as a woman says, oh no, I don't like men, actually I like women, people are like, no, there must be, I must have heard you wrong. Like, wait a minute. So a lot of the ambiguity with Sappho's sexuality has come from the Victorian era. They wanted to enjoy Sappho's poetry, but also not think of her as a lesbian heathen, basically. So they kind of created a lot of different stories about her and took their own liberties with her poetry. So a lot of her pronouns, all of her pronouns were changed to be straight pronouns instead of about women. A lot of her poetry actually includes gender neutral terms. So, okay, let's look at fragment 22, which is one of her most famous as well. It says, "Sweet mother, I can't do my weaving. Aphrodite has crushed me with desire for a blank." Different translators have changed that to either a tender youth, a girl, a boy. And what it comes down to is that word at the end in Greek is paidos. And the word paidos means young person, but it is not gendered. There is no gender to that word. So basically when a translator goes through there and he sees this she sees this ungendered word, they have to make a creative decision. Are they going to just say a youth, a young person, or are they gonna ascribe a gender and say a girl, a boy, to make it sound more relatable? A lot of the earlier translators of Sappho just were like, well, she must be straight, she's a girl, of course she's talking about a guy, and they changed those gender neutral terms to he or boy. So we love that. This is one of my favorite lines from Sappho. It's fragment 18, and it says, "But you hate the very thought of me, Athos, and you flutter after Andromeda." That just sounds like every lesbian drama I've ever heard, just jealousy, and lesbians have this like weird like web where they just find each other, and it seems like Athos, Andromeda, and Sappho were all in a little bit of a love triangle. I also want to read a little line from Sappho's fragment 19. She says, "Honestly, I wish I were dead." Great way to start off. "Weeping many tears, she left me and said, 'Alas, how terrible we suffer, Sappho. I really leave you against my will.' And I answered, 'Farewell, go and remember me. You know how we cared for you. If not, I would remind you of our wonderful times.'" What I want to get at here is she says, "Go and remember me, you know how we cared for you." It's plural, which highlights basically the lesbian community at that time. Not only were you finding a girlfriend when you were dating a woman, but you were being introduced to this lesbian community that outstretched open arms to you, basically. So when these women went and got married to men and had to leave their lesbian lovers, not only were they leaving their lovers, they were leaving their whole lesbian community. This lesbian community, queer community, and just women in general would meet together and have like these little parties together and meet each other. And eventually the men caught whiff of this and were like, "Excuse me, like these women are probably all having huge orgies without us." And so they basically shut down all these circles and tried to get rid of and eradicate the lesbian communities as much as they could, which is so typical. There was actually a quiet market in Greece for shoemakers who would take their excess leather and make dildos out of them and sell them to women to use on other women, basically on the black market. So that's a fun thing that was going on at the time. Okay, so Sappho was basically one of the greatest poets of her time. On one hand, people extolled her and loved her and used her work literally to teach other people. But then on the other hand, she also has a reputation for being mocked and promiscuous. And this reputation pretty much came a few hundred years after her death, when Athenian comedy started coming into play. And Athenian comedies were basically all satire, and they would have basically these big like sex comedies and everything would be very raunchy. And she became just a very prominent figure in these because of course people were just always intrigued by her sensuality, and she would be basically, her stock character was being portrayed as this promiscuous man-eater with this husband, but then she was always like going behind his back and like getting with all these men. Right now, when we think lesbian, we think gay, and that's because of Sappho, because she was from Lesbos and people know her as being the greatest lesbian, so they just equated the word lesbian as being a gay person. However, at the time, lesbian women, aka women from Lesbos, actually had a much different stereotype. They were known for being promiscuous and really good at giving head. That's right, blowjobs. Lesbians back then were known for blowjobs, and that was a common stereotype of Sappho. Also, going back to the husband, he was, in my personal opinion, a creation and a joke that just people tried to take seriously. His name was Kerkylos. Kerkylos basically translates to man with dick. I just don't believe that she had a husband, and I don't believe, that she prescribed to that. I think that she just dated her women and enjoyed her life. There's also a very big rumor created by Ovid, who spread a lot of weird contradicting facts about Sappho and rumors about Sappho. He wrote this whole thing about her saying that she basically got rid of all of her female lovers and fell in love with this man named Phaon, and she was so in love with him, but it was unrequited, so she ended up in her depression just throwing herself off of a cliff and killing herself. This was definitely a big thing that the Victorian era talked about. This is what most Victorian people knew of Sappho, was this great tragic ending with this love for this man Phaon, which is just a load of bullshit in my personal opinion. So yeah, Sappho is a very controversial figure. My camera cut me off, so I had to sit and wait for it to sync onto my computer before I could finish this video up, and it was really hot, and so I took my jacket off, and now my cat's sitting on it, so bye jacket. Just to wrap everything up, Sappho was known as the 10th muse. She was that good. People loved her, thought she was amazing, also hated her and made fun of her and called her a slut, basically. So that's just the legacy of any successful woman in my personal opinion. But go ahead and like and subscribe. There is a lot more goss coming your way. Go ahead and comment below anything that you didn't know about Sappho that you learned today, or who you want to hear about next. I think I'm going to talk about Sappho, basically the woman who came like 2,500 years before her and it may have influenced her writing. So like, subscribe, comment. Thanks for being here. I appreciate you, and I'll see you next week. Bye.